Be not far away, O Lord. You are my strength. Hasten to help me. Please be seated. Jesus and his disciples have crossed the Sea of Galilee to the opposite side. There they are met by a man who is unclothed, distorted from himself, apart from his community, chained, shackled, and living in the tombs. Despite his objections, Jesus will not let this man be tortured nor diminished any longer. Jesus commands the spirit to come out of the man. He then tries to connect with this man's humanity by asking his name. The name that he provides is the name of his condition, Legion. For we are told that many demons had entered him. His identity and his captivity had melded into one. But the name Legion had a literal meaning for the Gerasenes. It meant a unit of 6,000 Roman soldiers, an occupying army of empire which in the late 60s CE had laid siege to the region of Gerasa, killing thousands and burning down their village. Suddenly, this healing takes on social and political significance. The pig herders run into town to tell the people in the city and in the country what has happened. And when they arrive, they find the liberated man clothed, at peace, and sitting at the feet of Jesus. But after hearing how he has been freed, the people do not celebrate the good news. Instead, overwhelming fear hems them in and holds them captive. Freedom can be too dangerous, too costly. Though Legion has been expelled from the man, the memory of Legion still controls his community. The Gerasenes beg Jesus to leave them. Jesus goes away as they have asked, but not before commanding the man to return to the city and explain to them what God has done for him. The man obeys, spreading far and wide the good news about the mighty deeds of God in Jesus. Today we remember and celebrate June 19th, or Juneteenth, that is, as it has come to be known. On June 19th, 1865, a group of Union soldiers led by Major General Gordon Granger landed at Galveston, Texas, with the news that the war had ended, the Confederacy had surrendered, and those who had been enslaved were free. The executive order signed by President Lincoln had taken effect on January 1st, 1863, a full 2.5 years before. But until General Robert E. Lee surrendered at Appomattox on Palm Sunday in April 1865, there were not enough Union troops to spread or enforce the order. Now, as the news spread, there was a mixture of exhilaration and apprehension. These people had been living in slavery for more than 240 years. Their first steps were to find family members who had been sold away. Some headed north towards what they hoped would be true freedom. Some settled near the places they had last seen their sons and daughters, their brothers and sisters, their mothers and fathers, their husbands and wives. It soon became obvious that establishing a whole new society to which black people had previously been excluded would be challenging. That's an understatement. It was a chaotic time. But finally, Black people could begin to build a life that they had dreamed about. We know that this day must have started with tremendous promise. And this was followed by an even more hopeful period called Reconstruction, where formerly enslaved people were given the rights denied them under slavery: the right to marry, the right to own property, the right to be educated, the right to worship, the right to vote and hold political office, the right to earn a living, the right to receive equal justice under the law. At the beginning of 1867, fewer than 1% of Black men in the United States could vote. But by the end of 1867, that number was 80%. The Freedmen's Bureau was given 40 acres to newly freed slaves to begin to start their path towards economic independence. When the 14th Amendment to the Constitution was ratified in July 1868, more than 1,500 Black men moved into positions of public leadership. In the early 1870s, there would be 14 Black men in Congress, 2 senators, and 12 in the House of Representatives. In state houses across the South, Black men and white men were attempting to govern together for the first time. In South Carolina, where African Americans made up almost 60% of the population, voters elected a Black majority in the House of Representatives. It was a remarkable moment of hope. But Reconstruction was abandoned in just 12 years when political will failed in the country and formerly enslaved people were thrown back into a new form of slavery. First called Black Codes, brutally enforced by the Ku Klux Klan and others, and then descending into the hell of Jim Crow laws, where their guaranteed rights under the 14th and 15th Amendments were limited. So justice no longer was possible. Violence was rampant to prevent any of the rights acquired in that first decade after slavery. In fact, the rights obtained under Reconstruction in the 1870s would vanish and not appear again for Black people until it was fought for once more in the 1960s. Juneteenth is a day of celebration. It is a day to rejoice that slavery had finally been abolished, that formerly enslaved people were given the opportunity of freedom to walk away from an evil system, to begin to reestablish ties with family, to enter the long process of carving a life out of a hostile land. It is a day to celebrate that newly freed men and women were able to begin building the life of dignity and promise that God intends for us all. Juneteenth is also a day of remembrance. It is a day to recognize how far we have to go before true freedom exists for all God's children, and all are given the opportunity to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness promised in our country's founding documents. For too long, we have lived in two Americas. One is inhabited by white people with access to wealth and power, and one that is set off for those who are Black or brown or indigenous or queer or poor or other abled or foreign or in some way deemed outside the promises of this country. I have lived far too long unaware of my country's history and how my participation in systems that have served me personally have failed to support the fullness of life for others. I have become startlingly aware that racism has been outside of my life experience for far too long. Not until I was in graduate school did the stories of my black brothers and sisters crash into my isolated bubble of white privilege. And what I mean by white privilege is not that any day soon I am going to be piloting a rocket towards Mars. But I have never been followed in a store. And I raised 3 sons. And never once did I have to tell them methods to stay alive just because of the color of their skin. The Reverend Rebecca Parker, in her article in the book, Building the World We Dream About, said, "To come of age in America as a white person is to be educated into ignorance. It is to be culturally shaped to not know and not want to know the actual context in which you live. And too many people with my shade of skin want to keep ignorance at this level. They want to ban books from libraries. They want to prohibit teaching about race or gender or immigration. They want to shape a narrative so that the struggles of black citizens are considered to be individual failings rather than the outcome of centuries of systemic racism." But on this Juneteenth, standing here in this beautiful cathedral with you, I want to claim a different path. I know that some of you have participated in the Sacred Ground curriculum produced by the Episcopal Church. I just completed a 10-week course with a group from my former church in Austin, Texas. I am eternally grateful for Zoom. I do not believe that we can go from acknowledging that slavery was bad to offering a simple apology and moving on. That is not what our faith teaches us. Jesus did not take the easy path to resurrection. That is not what brings about hope and wholeness. I believe our first step is to learn. We need to learn about what happened after Juneteenth. You may know this. I wasn't taught this in my schools. What happened when the Civil War ended? We need to learn about all the ways this country and its promises have failed so many who have lived and worked and sacrificed to be a part of this society. Not somewhere else but here is a phrase from a love poem by Adrienne Rich that invokes love's imperative. A lover is drawn to what is present, to what is real, what is here, what is now, what is flesh. In its beauty and its tragedy, its burden of grief and its full measure of joy, life is loved through presence, not absence. Through connection, not alienation. As followers of Christ, we should take a leading role in learning about the great sin of this country. I believe Sacred Ground makes a good start to begin our corrective education. And we should listen, and we should listen, and we should listen again to the voices of those who are not ours. Black people, Latino and Latina people, Asian people, gay, lesbian, and transgender people. These are the voices that will tell us truth about our country. And once we learn, we must lament. We must name the traumas. For all the goodness of God, people were stolen from their homes, brought to this country, and enslaved for 243 years. And then segregated, denied life, prosperity, and justice for an additional 100 years. We can't help but lament if we know. We must grieve it deeply. And as Cole Arthur Riley says in a beautiful book I highly recommend, Lament itself is a form of hope. It is an innate awareness that what is should not be. True lament is not born from that trite sentiment that the world is bad, but from a deep conviction that it is worthy of goodness. Lament begins the process of developing a moral imagination of what justice looks like, of what communities that foster life looks like. As followers of Jesus Christ, we are not to settle for what is. Rather, we are to expand our imagination toward the possibility that God promises us all. Third, I believe we must repent. We must move from passivity to creative participation. The struggle of Black people for freedom in this country is played out in many areas: education, law, housing, healthcare, economics, environment, food. To become engaged in learning where separation and discrimination occurs, we can listen and we can act. We need to be a part of recovering and restoring the opportunities for all humanity. One way we can all participate is to vote. As Christians, it is our responsibility to learn about each individual candidate and vote. And we must be a part of repair. Because Reconstruction failed to support Black people as they grew their businesses, farmed their land, voted their conscience, attended resource schools, the newly freed people were deprived of many of the opportunities of this country. And institutions, including the church, profited greatly from the work of enslaved people. Now, I know the word reparations can cause anxiety. It may sound like that every individual person will be required to repair centuries of slavery, segregation, and discrimination. Remember last week I told you we're children of a triune God. We are not meant to do this alone. But as a community, as a church, much can be accomplished. The church is already active in beginning this process of repair. My own seminary, Virginia Theological Seminary in Alexandria, Virginia, first acknowledged that much of the campus was built by enslaved labor, and that several of the faculty owned humans as property. In September 2019, they announced that they plan to create a $1.7 million reparations fund to begin to repay the debt from its exploitation of Black laborers. The Diocese of Maryland just announced an initial round of grants totaling $175,000 to 6 community organizations that are working to improve the lives of African Americans and strengthen Black communities. Bishop Eugene Sutton of Maryland said in his introduction at the awards ceremony, "We researched our church's history. We know of our church's involvement, first of all, in slavery. We also researched into how we as an institution, like all of the other institutions in society, benefited materially and financially from the centuries of racial injustice, even after slavery." And that did not sit well with us. The dioceses of New Jersey, New York, Texas, Minnesota, Virginia, and Washington are all in the process of determining how to best repair centuries of their participation in and profit from racist systems. Martin Luther King Jr. said, "Justice at its best is love correcting everything that stands against love." Let me say that one more time because I didn't do that well. Martin Luther King Jr. said, "Justice at its best is love correcting everything that stands against love." From the moment that the man with the demons confront Jesus, the whole episode invites us to consider what Jesus has to do with forces that occupy and control. This reading does not deny the reality of extraordinary mental anguish, nor diminishes Jesus' miraculous healing. Instead, it challenges us to think more broadly about Jesus' sovereignty over the powers that destroy human life. Jesus comes to challenge and cast out every power that prevents us from living fully and freely as human beings created in God's image. Jesus claims sovereignty not just over our souls, but over our lives here on earth. Many may resist that news, finding deliverance from legion too frightening, too demanding, too costly. But those whom Jesus has healed know that this liberating love is good news. Our hope is in the reality that today God is at work in Jesus, bringing God's kingdom, God's freedom, God's promise of justice and peace on earth as it is in heaven. May we all be a part of this good news. Amen.